Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly mundane and not so exciting world of meerkats, those adorable creatures who've been sold to us as nature's ultimate sentries, standing guard in the African desert. While documentaries make them look heroic and fascinating, the truth is, being a meerkat is actually pretty boring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up one morning and discover that sometime during the night, your body has apparently been replaced by a collection of limbs that belong to someone else entirely. Your legs have grown 3 inches longer while you slept, which would be impressive if they remembered to tell your brain about the update. You stumble out of the burrow like someone learning to walk in stilts made of spaghetti. The other juveniles are experiencing similar betrayals from their own bodies. There's Pip, whose ears have suddenly decided they're satellite dishes, and Squeaks, who keeps tripping over his own tail like it's a personal vendetta. Together, you form what can only be described as a support group for the anatomically confused. Your first hunting lesson goes about as well as you'd expect from someone whose paws have apparently never met before today. The instructor, a patient adult named Grit who's clearly questioning his life choices, points to a beetle roughly the size of your head wandering around in plain sight. "Right," he says, in the tone of someone who's explained this 17 times already. "Slow approach, keep low, strike fast." You nod confidently, because how hard could it be? It's one beetle. It's not even moving particularly fast. It's practically volunteering to be lunch. You begin your approach with all the stealth of a small earthquake. The beetle, perhaps sensing the disturbance in the force, begins meandering in the opposite direction. You adjust your trajectory, which involves more stumbling and what can generously be called tactical falling. The beetle continues its leisurely stroll, probably wondering why the ground keeps shaking. When you finally commit to your strike, you discover that your new legs have different ideas about where they should be pointing. You leap with tremendous confidence in roughly the direction where the beetle was 3 seconds ago, land face first in the sand, and come up spitting grit while the beetle continues its unhurried journey to somewhere that isn't here. "Well," says Grit, after a pause that stretches just long enough to be uncomfortable, "that was an attempt." The other juveniles don't fare much better. Pip launches himself with such enthusiasm that he overshoots his target by a full meter and crashes into a thorn bush. Squeaks gets his tail tangled in his own legs and ends up chasing his target in what can only be described as a combat role. The beetles, meanwhile, continue their business with the casual indifference of creatures who've clearly seen this show before. But hunting isn't your only challenge. Apparently, growing up also means learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of meerkat society without accidentally causing a minor international incident. Take alarm calls, for instance. There are, according to the adults, over 30 different vocalizations that roughly translate to various shades of "oh no." There's the aerial predator call, which means look up and panic. There's the terrestrial predator call, which means look around and panic. There's the snake call, which means panic in a very specific direction. And then there are about 27 subtle variations that apparently convey crucial information about distance, size, threat level, and probably the weather forecast. You, being young and enthusiastic, decide to practice these calls. Unfortunately, your voice is currently going through what can only be described as an awkward phase, cracking at unexpected moments, and producing sounds that don't appear in any official meerkat vocabulary. Your first attempt at an aerial alert comes out sounding like someone strangling a kazoo. The entire mob immediately assumes battle stations, looking skyward with expressions of grim determination, while you realize with mounting horror that there's no actual eagle, just you, practicing. False alarm! You squeak. But by then, half the group has already disappeared into the nearest bolt holes, and the other half is glaring at you with the special intensity reserved for people who yell fire in crowded theatres. Grit appears at your shoulder with the weary expression of someone whose job security depends on keeping juveniles alive, despite their best efforts to the contrary. "Practice," he says, "is for when we're safely underground." The snake incident happens on a Tuesday, which seems unfairly mundane for what turns out to be your first real brush with actual mortality. You're foraging near a rocky outcrop, finally managing to dig up something that might be edible, when you hear it. a sound like silk being dragged across sand, soft and continuous, and definitely not supposed to be there. You freeze, which is actually the correct response, though you arrive at it through sheer terror rather than training. The sound stops. The desert holds its breath. Even the wind seems to pause, as if nature itself is waiting to see what happens next. Slowly, very slowly, you turn your head. About 2 meters away, coiled in the shadow of a rock that you swear wasn't there 5 minutes ago, is a puff adder. It's not a particularly large puff adder, but size becomes irrelevant when you realize that this snake contains enough venom to kill something considerably larger than you, and it appears to be taking a professional interest in your continued existence. The snake's head moves with the kind of deliberate precision that suggests it's calculating angles and trajectories. Its eyes have the flat, ancient intelligence of something that's been perfecting the art of not being bothered by mammals for roughly 50 million years. Your training kicks in, which is to say that your brain starts screaming a continuous stream of alarm calls while your body remains frozen like a furry statue. The snake, perhaps interpreting your stillness as either respect or resignation, begins to uncoil with the leisurely confidence of a predator that's in no particular hurry. It's Grit who saves you, appearing from nowhere with the kind of casual efficiency that makes experienced adults look like they're performing magic. One moment you're contemplating your brief and largely unsuccessful life, and the next moment Grit is herding you away from the snake with firm but gentle nudges, while the puff adder settles back into its coil with what you swear looks like mild disappointment. "Next time," Grit says, "once you're a safe distance away, and your heart rate has dropped below hummingbird levels. When you hear that sound, you back away. Slowly. No sudden movements, no panic calls, no dramatic gestures. Just don't be there anymore." You nod, still shaking slightly. "What if I can't move?" "Then you stand very still until you can," he says. "Fear is useful. Panic gets you killed. There's a difference." As the weeks pass, you begin to find your rhythm. It's not a graceful rhythm, more like the beat you'd get if you asked a tone-deaf drummer to play while falling downstairs, but it's yours. Your hunting success rate improves from catastrophic to occasionally edible, and you learn to distinguish between the 17 different ways adults say your name, ranging from mild disappointment to active concern for your continued survival. The desert changes around you like a vast, slow kaleidoscope. The harsh summer heat gives way to the golden warmth of autumn, when the light turns honey-thick and the shadows grow long and purple. You discover that you've developed preferences for certain foraging spots, opinions about weather patterns, and the ability to find your way home even when you've wandered farther than you probably should have. You're growing up, in the slow, awkward way that growing up happens when you're trying to do it while avoiding being eaten. The revelation that meerkats have over 30 different ways to say "oh no" comes as something of a shock. You'd assumed that danger was danger, and that yelling about it was fairly straightforward. You're beginning to understand that meerkat communication is less like speaking, and more like conducting an orchestra, where every instrument represents a different flavor of impending doom. There's the eagle from the southeast call, which has a rising inflection that apparently conveys both direction and urgency. There's the something moving in the bushes but I can't tell what call, which maintains a steady pitch that suggests caution without panic. There's the snake, but it's probably not interested in us call, which you're told requires a particular tonal quality that you haven't quite mastered. And then there are the specialty calls that seem designed specifically to humble juveniles who think they're getting the hang of things. The large carnivore at medium distance moving toward the secondary escape route call requires perfect pitch, precise timing, and apparently the ability to convey complex tactical information while maintaining the kind of calm that suggests you definitely know what you're talking about. Your voice, meanwhile, continues to crack at the worst possible moments. You attempt a sophisticated, possible aerial threat, unclear distance, and produce something that sounds like a rusty gate being opened by someone with arthritis. The other juveniles snicker, the adults sigh, even the beetles seem unimpressed. But practice, as it turns out, does eventually lead to something resembling competence. Your first successful alert comes on a morning when the sky is the color of old brass, and the air carries the promise of heat that will later make you question your life choices. You're on foraging duty, digging half-heartedly for grubs while keeping one eye on your surroundings in the way that's become automatic. That's when you see it. A shadow moving against the wind, too regular to be natural, too purposeful to be anything good. Your training kicks in before your brain fully processes what you're seeing. The call emerges clean and clear, with the proper pitch and inflection that you've been practicing for weeks. Aerial predator, approaching from the north, high altitude. The response is immediate and gratifying. The entire foraging group disappears into the nearest available cover with the fluid efficiency of a magic trick. You follow, diving into a convenient bolt hole just as the secretary bird passes overhead, its long legs trailing behind it like afterthoughts. From your hiding spot, you watch the bird circle once, twice, then move on in search of easier prey. The all clear comes from Grit, and slowly, cautiously, the group emerges back into the sunlight. "Good call," says Grit, and you realize that these might be the two most beautiful words in the meerkat language. Clean, clear, accurate timing. That's how it's done. The other juveniles look at you with something approaching respect, which is a significant upgrade from their usual expression of mild pity. Even Pip, whose ears have finally grown to match the rest of his head, gives you an approving nod. You've discovered that being good at yelling about danger is surprisingly marketable in meerkat society. It's a skill that everyone needs, but not everyone masters, like being able to fold fitted sheets or parallel park in tight spaces. Once word gets around that you can be trusted to spot trouble and communicate it clearly, you find yourself being included in foraging expeditions with increasing frequency. The other juveniles begin to form what you realize is essentially a support network for the collectively clueless. There's Pip, whose oversized ears actually give him exceptional hearing, making him excellent at detecting subtle sounds. Squeaks has developed an uncanny ability to spot movement in peripheral vision, probably because he's spent so much time falling over and observing the world from unusual angles. Tumble, who earned his name through an incident involving a steep slope and poor decision-making, turns out to have an exceptional sense of smell. Together, you form an early warning system that actually works, despite being composed entirely of individuals who couldn't catch a sleeping beetle if their lives depended on it. Which, you're beginning to understand, they occasionally do. Your communication skills improve through necessity and repetition. You learn the subtle difference between concern and alarm, the way timing can make the difference between a measured response and mass panic, the importance of staying calm when everything around you is designed to make you lose your mind. You also learn that there's a social hierarchy even among the alarm callers. The adults who've been doing this for years can convey complex information in calls so subtle that you sometimes miss them entirely. They speak in a kind of shorthand that suggests experience with every possible variation of danger, a professional calm that comes from having survived long enough to develop opinions about technique. The foraging locations each have their own personalities, you discover. The rocky outcrops where beetle grubs hide beneath stones, but where snakes also like to sun themselves on warm afternoons. The soft sand areas, where digging is easy, but escape routes are limited. The thorny patches, where the best insects shelter, but where getting trapped means dealing with both predators and very pointed plant life. You begin to develop preferences, strategies, a growing sense of which risks are worth taking, and which are just bad decision-making with extra steps. You learn to read the subtle signs that suggest a particular area might be worth exploring, or might be better avoided until later in the day, or might be the kind of place where you really want to have someone else test the waters first. Your success rate improves from occasionally spots obvious threats to reliably helpful member of the team. You discover that competence, even limited competence, feels remarkably good. You're no longer just along for the ride. You're contributing to the collective effort of not dying, which is perhaps the most important job description in the natural world. The mistake happens on a morning when the sky is the color of old pearl, and the air carries the scent of distant rain. The mob is preparing for one of its periodic relocations, a careful, organized movement to new foraging territory that's been scouted and approved by the adults, with the kind of thorough planning usually reserved for military operations. The plan is simple. Stay together, follow the lead scouts, stop when they stop, move when they move, and under no circumstances wander off to investigate anything interesting. It's the kind of straightforward instruction that should be impossible to misunderstand. Naturally, you manage to misunderstand it completely. The confusion begins when you spot what you're certain is another group of meerkats moving parallel to your own mob, about 50 meters to the east. They seem to be heading in roughly the same direction, moving with the same careful, purposeful pace. In your juvenile wisdom, you conclude that this must be part of the same migration, perhaps a secondary group taking a different route to the same destination. When your own group pauses for a rest and tactical reassessment, you notice that the other group continues moving. This strikes you as odd but not particularly alarming. Maybe they're on a different schedule. Maybe they know something your group doesn't. Maybe, and this is where your reasoning takes a sharp turn into questionable territory, you should investigate to make sure everyone stays coordinated. You slip away from your resting group with the stealth of someone who's watched too many adventure stories and not enough educational documentaries about natural selection. Your plan, such as it is, involves quickly checking with the other group and then reporting back with whatever useful information you discover. It's going to be a brief reconnaissance mission, the kind of initiative that might even earn you some grudging respect from the adults. The other group turns out to be farther away than it looked, which is your first hint that this adventure might not unfold exactly as planned. By the time you get close enough to realize that these aren't meerkats at all, but rather a family of ground squirrels who are probably wondering why they're being stalked by a confused young carnivore, you've traveled considerably farther from your own mob than any reasonable definition of quick check would suggest. When you turn around to head back, you discover the second flaw in your plan. The landscape, which looked perfectly navigable on the way out, now resembles a vast, beige maze designed by someone with a grudge against people trying to find their way home. The Kalahari, you realize, has many moods, and one of them is aggressively unhelpful to lost juveniles. The grass that seems short and manageable from a distance now towers over you like a golden forest. Every termite mound looks exactly like every other termite mound. The sun, which should be providing useful directional information, appears to be shining from everywhere at once just to spite you. You climb the tallest termite mound you can find, hoping for a better view of your surroundings. From this elevated position, you can see more grass, occasionally interrupted by more termite mounds, stretching in every direction to the horizon, broken only by the occasional acacia tree that might as well be a mirage for all the navigational help it provides. This is when the panic sets in. Not the useful, energizing kind of panic that helps you run away from snakes, but the cold, spreading kind that makes you realize you've made the sort of mistake that appears in cautionary tales told to other juveniles. You're alone in an environment that contains numerous creatures specifically designed to eat small, lost meerkats. You have no idea which direction leads home. Your group, assuming they've noticed you're missing, could be anywhere within a gradually expanding circle of possibilities that grows larger with every minute you stand here contemplating your situation. The solution, when it comes, involves less clever navigation and more stubborn wandering in what you desperately hope is the right general direction. You move from one source of cover to the next, pausing frequently to listen for familiar sounds, and mostly hearing the kind of ominous silence that suggests the desert is waiting to see what you'll do next. The grass rustles around you with every breath of wind, creating a continuous whisper that sounds suspiciously like laughter. Your own footsteps seem ridiculously loud. Every shadow could conceal something with teeth and an interest in your continued existence, or lack thereof. You find your group through a combination of luck, determination, and the kind of divine intervention usually reserved for people who've learned important lessons about the value of following instructions. The sound of familiar voices carries across the grass like the most beautiful music you've ever heard, and you follow it with the focused intensity of someone who's discovered that independence is considerably less appealing than it sounded in theory. Grit finds you first, emerging from the grass with the expression of someone who's been having the kind of day that ages you prematurely. "There you are," he says, in a tone that manages to convey relief, exasperation, and the promise of a very educational conversation about decision-making. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd decided to pursue a career in being snake food." The walk back to the group passes in relative silence, broken only by occasional observations about the importance of staying together during migrations, the various creatures that enjoy eating lost juveniles, and the statistical likelihood of successfully navigating unfamiliar territory without proper training or preparation. You rejoin the mob with the sheepish awareness that you've provided everyone with an exciting story to tell, and yourself with a very thorough lesson about the difference between independence and getting spectacularly lost. The other juveniles greet your return with the mixture of relief and amusement, typically reserved for people who've survived doing something notably stupid. Winter in the Kalahari arrives with the subtlety of a landlord raising rent, gradually, then all at once, until you're wondering how exactly you're supposed to manage with significantly fewer resources than you had before. The days grow shorter and cooler, which would be pleasant if it didn't come with the side effect of making every edible creature in the desert decide that hibernation sounds like an excellent life choice. The change starts gradually. The sun, which spent the summer months trying to turn you into jerky, now provides barely enough warmth to take the edge off the morning chill. The beetles become scarce, then rare, then mythical creatures spoken of in hushed tones by adults who remember the abundance of warmer months. Your first winter lesson comes courtesy of your stomach, which has opinions about the reduced meal schedule. Apparently, finding food was always going to get more difficult, but nobody mentioned that more difficult would feel quite so much like nearly impossible. The grubs that were everywhere during summer have either emerged as flying insects and departed for warmer climates, or burrowed so deep that finding them requires the kind of excavation project typically associated with archaeological digs. The beetles that remain have become suspicious and elusive, as if they've attended a seminar on avoiding meerkats and taken detailed notes. Grit gathers the juveniles for what he calls winter survival orientation, which sounds much more official than here's how to eat things you previously considered inedible. The lesson takes place near a patch of dry grass that's been thoroughly investigated by several generations of hungry meerkats. Right, he says, settling onto his haunches with the weary patience of someone who's given this lecture many times before. Winter is nature's way of asking how badly you want to keep existing. The answer, from our perspective, is quite badly. Thank you. So we're going to discuss expanding your dietary horizons. He gestures toward a collection of items that you would previously have categorized as things that are technically organic, but definitely not food. There are roots that look like they've been carved from wood, seeds that appear to be mostly shell with occasional hints of nutritional content, and what might charitably be called tubers, but look more like the desert's attempt at abstract art. These, he continues, are what we eat when the beetles are being uncooperative. They taste approximately like you'd expect, but they contain enough nutrition to keep you alive, which is really all we're aiming for here. The first tuber you try tastes like dirt with ambitions of becoming cardboard. The second one is an improvement, in that it tastes like slightly less awful dirt. By the third, you're beginning to understand that palatable is a relative concept, and right now, it's relative to starving. Your family dynamics, meanwhile, take on the distinctive charm of people who are all slightly hungry most of the time. The adults become shorter-tempered, more focused, less inclined to tolerate juvenile nonsense. The other juveniles grow competitive in ways that would have seemed petty during the abundance of summer, but now feel like reasonable survival strategies. Pip develops a tendency to hover near any adult who's successfully found food, hoping to benefit from whatever scraps might be available. Squeaks becomes possessive about his foraging spots, marking them with the kind of territorial intensity usually reserved for international border disputes. Even Tumble, previously the most laid-back of your peer group, begins eyeing your digging efforts with the calculating gaze of someone keeping track of who's finding what. You discover that hunger makes everything seem more urgent and less amusing. The social interactions that were merely annoying during summer become sources of genuine irritation. The physical comedy of juvenile clumsiness stops being funny when everyone's operating with reduced energy reserves. But winter also brings unexpected beauty. The desert sky turns the color of old silver, and the light becomes thin and precise, casting shadows that are somehow both softer and more defined than the harsh contrasts of summer. The stars emerge earlier and shine with the kind of clarity that makes you understand why people write poetry about night skies. The cold air carries scents differently, bringing news of distant rain, faraway fires, the movements of other creatures navigating their own seasonal challenges. You learn to read weather patterns in the behavior of clouds, the direction of wind, the way light reflects off the horizon in the early morning. There are nights when the temperature drops enough that the group clusters together for warmth, creating a communal heat source that's both practical and oddly comforting. These are the times when the older adults tell stories, not the instructional tales about avoiding predators or finding food, but the kind of rambling narratives that seem designed to pass time and maintain morale during the long, cold hours before dawn. You hear about winters past, migrations that went spectacularly wrong, legendary characters from previous generations who achieved fame through either remarkable competence or equally remarkable stupidity. There's Great Aunt Pepper, who once survived an entire week underground during a severe cold snap by methodically eating her way through a discovered cache of stored beetle larvae. There's Cousin Dart, who managed to get lost during a blizzard and was found 3 days later, perfectly fine, in the burrow of a completely different meerkat family who'd apparently adopted him as a temporary member. The stories serve multiple purposes: entertainment, education, and the reassurance that other meerkats have survived worse circumstances through a combination of determination and luck. They also help pass the long nights when sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by cold, hunger, and the kind of dreams that feature unlimited supplies of fat, sluggish beetles. You begin to develop a deeper understanding of the seasonal rhythm that governs everything in the desert. Summer is about abundance and growth, preparing for the lean times ahead. Winter is about persistence and patience, making the best of limited resources while waiting for conditions to improve. Spring will bring renewal and new opportunities. But first, you have to survive the testing ground of scarcity. The philosophical aspect of winter survival settles on you gradually, like the accumulation of sand in the wind. You're learning that comfort is temporary, that abundance can't be assumed, that the ability to adapt to changing conditions is perhaps the most important skill you can develop. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from successfully foraging when resources are scarce, from contributing to the group's survival when everyone's working harder just to maintain basic existence. It's different from the easy success of summer hunting, more earned, more meaningful, carrying the weight of real necessity. Winter, you realize, is nature's way of asking not just how badly you want to keep existing, but what you're willing to do to earn that continued existence. The answer, it turns out, involves eating a lot of questionable tubers and developing a much deeper appreciation for the simple pleasure of not being hungry. Spring arrives in the desert like a party you weren't invited to, but can hear from next door, sudden, energetic, and featuring activities that everyone else seems to understand better than you do. The rains come first, turning the beige landscape into something approaching green, followed by an explosion of insects that makes winter's scarcity seem like a bad dream you've finally woken up from. With the abundance of food comes a shift in social dynamics that you're not entirely prepared for. The adults begin engaging in behaviors that range from inexplicable to mildly embarrassing, involving a lot of strutting, posturing, and what can only be described as showing off. Even worse, some of the juveniles your age seem to be catching whatever this is. You first notice it in Pip, whose recently grown into ears apparently make him feel like he's ready to impress members of the opposite sex. He's developed a swagger that looks like someone trying to walk confidently while wearing shoes that don't fit, and he's taken to grooming himself with the dedication usually reserved for preparing for job interviews. "Looking good today, Pip," you comment, watching him work on his coat with what appears to be a small mirror made of still water. "Got to make an effort," he replies, not looking up from his reflection. "Spring's here, you know. Time to, make an impression. You don't know, actually, but you nod anyway, because that seems like the supportive thing to do. Your own romantic education begins when you notice her. She's a young female from a neighboring territory, part of a group that's moved closer during the seasonal abundance. She has the kind of sleek coat that suggests good genetics and excellent foraging skills, and she moves with the confident grace of someone who's never accidentally fallen into her own digging hole. Her name, you learn through careful intelligence gathering that definitely isn't stalking, is Swift, which seems unfairly appropriate, given that she appears to excel at everything that you're still learning to do without injuring yourself. Your courtship strategy, such as it is, involves trying to impress her with your recently acquired competencies. You demonstrate your alarm-calling skills by providing detailed warnings about threats that may or may not actually exist. You showcase your foraging abilities by digging elaborate holes in her general vicinity, occasionally uncovering something edible, but more often just rearranging sand in patterns that probably don't impress anyone. Swift observes these displays with the polite attention of someone watching a performance they didn't request but don't want to be rude about. She nods at appropriate intervals, makes encouraging sounds when you successfully locate a grub, and maintains the kind of friendly distance that suggests she's categorized you somewhere between harmless entertainment and minor natural hazard. The competition, meanwhile, comes in the form of a juvenile male from her own group named, inevitably, Dash. He's everything you're not: smooth, confident, possessed of the kind of natural athleticism that makes hunting look effortless, rather than like an extended exercise in applied clumsiness. You watch Dash demonstrate his skills for Swift's benefit, moving through a complex hunting sequence with the fluid precision of someone who's never questioned whether his paws will be where he expects them to be. He stalks, pounces, and emerges with a particularly fat beetle that he presents to Swift with casual gallantry. Swift accepts the beetle with obvious appreciation, consuming it while making small sounds of approval that you've never heard her make about any of your own foraging discoveries. Your response to this challenge involves doubling down on your current strategy, which is to say, trying harder at the same things that weren't working particularly well to begin with. You dig more holes, call more alarms, and generally increase the volume and frequency of your romantic displays without significantly improving their quality. The climax of your courtship campaign comes when you decide to present Swift with the largest, most impressive beetle you can possibly find. This quest leads you to venture into territory that's probably better left unexplored, dig holes that are definitely deeper than necessary, and invest several hours in what becomes an increasingly desperate search for arthropod excellence. You finally locate your target, a beetle so large and magnificent that it seems like nature's gift to ambitious young suitors. It's perfect, fat, slow-moving, and so obviously superior to any beetle ever presented by any rival that Swift will have no choice but to recognize your exceptional provider potential. The presentation goes spectacularly wrong. In your nervousness, you manage to drop the beetle just as you reach Swift, watch it land upside down in a patch of soft sand, and then observe helplessly as it rights itself and trundles away with the unhurried dignity of something that has places to be and no time for amateur courtship rituals. Swift watches this performance with what you choose to interpret as thoughtful consideration rather than barely contained amusement. "That was," she begins, then pauses, apparently searching for words that won't cause permanent psychological damage. "That was very thoughtful of you," which is when you realize that thoughtful is not the word you were hoping to hear from someone you're trying to impress with your romantic potential. The conclusion of your first romance attempt comes naturally and without drama. Swift pairs off with Dash during a social gathering that involves a lot of mutual grooming and shared beetle consumption. You observe this development from a respectful distance, discovering that rejection doesn't actually kill you, which comes as something of a relief. Grit finds you later, sitting on a termite mound and contemplating the complex social dynamics of seasonal mating, with the philosophical resignation of someone who's just learned that wanting something doesn't automatically make you qualified to have it. "First time?" he asks, settling beside you with the weary patience of someone who's seen this particular drama play out many times before. You nod, not trusting your voice to maintain its recently acquired maturity. "Gets easier," he says, "or at least you get better at it. Eventually, you figure out that being yourself works better than trying to be impressive. Takes a while, though. You consider this wisdom while watching Swift and Dash engage in what appears to be a very successful example of being naturally compatible with each other. Spring continues around you, full of renewal and new possibilities, most of which you're apparently not ready for yet. But that's fine, you decide. There will be other springs, other opportunities, other chances to figure out how to be impressively yourself rather than just trying to be impressive. For now, you're content to master the considerably simpler challenge of not falling into your own digging holes. The morning you discover your calling arrives without fanfare, which seems appropriate for someone whose calling turns out to be standing on rocks and looking worried for a living. You're participating in what Grit generously calls career exploration, and what feels more like systematic elimination of everything you're spectacularly bad at. The process begins with foraging assessment, which involves following an expert named Scratch as she demonstrates the fine art of locating food that doesn't want to be found. Scratch has the kind of methodical patience that comes from years of successful digging, and she approaches each potential foraging site with the focused intensity of someone reading a fascinating book written in beetles and grubs. "Right," she says, pausing beside a patch of seemingly unremarkable sand. "What do you see here?" You look at the sand. It's sandy, beige, relatively flat. It has the general appearance of sand that's been sand for quite some time, and intends to continue being sand for the foreseeable future. "Sand," you venture. Scratch sighs with the weary patience of someone who's asked this question many times before. "Look closer. What does the sand tell you?" You stare harder at the sand, hoping it will spontaneously develop conversational abilities. It doesn't. The sand maintains its policy of being sand and nothing more. "The texture," Scratch prompts. "The color variations, the way it's settled, the small disturbances in the surface pattern." You examine the sand again, this time noticing that there are indeed subtle variations in its appearance. Some areas are slightly more compacted than others. There are tiny irregularities in the surface that might indicate something. Possibly. There's different textures? You offer. "Exactly," says Scratch, beginning to dig in a spot that looks absolutely identical to everywhere else. "This tells us about moisture content, soil composition, the likelihood of finding grubs at various depths. Watch." She digs with the precise efficiency of someone who's done this calculation thousands of times, and within moments produces a fat grub that looks like it's been waiting specifically for this appointment. Your own attempt at soil analysis results in 3 empty holes, 1 angry beetle that definitely wasn't supposed to be disturbed, and a minor landslide that buries your paws up to the wrists. Scratch observes this performance with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Perhaps, she says diplomatically, we should explore other options. The Sentinel trial goes somewhat better, which is to say that you manage to avoid causing any major disasters while standing on elevated surfaces and looking around for threats. The position requires the ability to remain alert for extended periods, distinguish between various types of movement in the environment, and communicate findings clearly and calmly to the group below. The mentor for this assessment is an experienced sentinel named Sharp, whose job involves spending significant portions of each day standing motionless on termite mounds, while maintaining the kind of focused attention usually associated with air traffic controllers. The key, Sharp explains, positioning you on a medium-sized termite mound with good sightlines in all directions, is learning to see movement that doesn't belong. Everything out here moves: grass, leaves, insects, other animals. Your job is to spot the movement that might represent danger to the group. You settle into position and begin your surveillance of the surrounding landscape. At first, everything seems static, a vast expanse of brown and gold stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional acacia tree and scattered termite mounds. Then, gradually, you begin to notice the subtle motion that's constantly happening around you. Grass bends and straightens in the wind. Insects move in small, busy patterns among the vegetation. Birds land, forage briefly, and take off again. Small mammals dart between patches of cover, each following their own mysterious agendas for survival and food acquisition. The challenge is learning to distinguish between normal desert business and something that might eat us. A beetle crossing open ground moves differently than a snake hunting. A bird landing to rest has different body language than a bird of prey evaluating potential targets. Wind-blown grass follows patterns that are distinctly different from grass being disturbed by something moving through it. Your first successful spot comes 20 minutes into the exercise, when you notice movement in a patch of thorn scrub that doesn't match the rhythm of the wind. Something is moving through the vegetation with purpose, and it's considerably larger than anything that should be casually wandering around while meerkats are foraging nearby. Movement in the scrub, southeastern approach, approximately 70 meters. You call down to Sharp, using the clear, calm tone you've been practicing. Sharp immediately shifts to high alert, scanning the area you've indicated. After a moment, he spots it too, a caracal moving with the liquid stealth of something that definitely has meerkats on its list of acceptable lunch options. Good eye, Sharp says, issuing the appropriate warning call to the foraging group. Clean spotting, accurate distance estimation, calm communication. That's exactly how it's done. The caracal, perhaps sensing that its element of surprise has been compromised, changes course and disappears back into the scrub with the philosophical resignation of a predator that will have to find lunch elsewhere. You remain on sentinel duty for the rest of the morning, successfully identifying 2 more potential threats: a ground hornbill and something that might have been a jackal but turned out to be a log, and gradually developing what can only be described as professional satisfaction with the work. There's something deeply appealing about the sentinel role that you hadn't expected. The combination of responsibility and solitude, the requirement for sustained attention and calm decision-making, the way the job involves protecting others while maintaining your own safety. It all feels like a natural fit for your particular combination of skills and temperament. You've got the instincts for this, Sharp tells you at the end of the assessment. Good eye for movement, steady nerves, clear communication. The patience will develop with practice, and you've already got better situational awareness than most juveniles your age. The digging assessment is educational. You spend an afternoon with an expert excavator named Burrow, who approaches underground construction with the focused intensity of someone designing subway systems for very small passengers. Digging, Burrow explains, leading you to a site where the mob is expanding their burrow network, is about much more than just moving sand around. It's engineering, architecture, and urban planning all rolled into one very dirty job. He shows you the intricate network of tunnels that lies beneath the seemingly simple entrance holes. Chambers for sleeping, storage areas for emergency food supplies, multiple escape routes leading to concealed exits, nursery areas designed specifically for raising young. It's an underground city that would be impressive even without considering that it was built entirely by creatures armed with nothing but claws and determination. Your own contribution to this architectural marvel consists mainly of enthusiastic but poorly directed digging that occasionally results in actual tunnel advancement, but more often creates what Burrow politely describes as artistic interpretations of structural engineering. The thing about digging, Burrow says, observing your latest attempt at tunnel construction, which appears to be heading toward the surface at an angle that suggests it's trying to escape rather than expand the Burrow system, is that it requires a very specific kind of spatial reasoning. You have to think in 3 dimensions while working in conditions where you can't actually see the 3 dimensions you're thinking about. You nod thoughtfully while contemplating the hole you've just dug, which seems to be developing its own weather system. Perhaps, Burrow suggests with the diplomatic tact of someone delivering unwelcome news gently, we might consider focusing on your other strengths. The final assessment involves what Grit describes as general survival competency, which seems to translate to, let's see if you can get through a normal day without creating any emergency situations. This involves a comprehensive evaluation of your foraging abilities, threat recognition, communication skills, group cooperation, and what he calls general not getting everyone killedness. You spend the day participating in routine mob activities while being observed by various adults who make notes about your performance with the kind of professional detachment usually associated with job interviews or medical examinations. Your foraging turns out to be adequate rather than impressive. You can reliably find enough food to sustain yourself without requiring rescue by more competent members of the group. Your threat recognition has improved significantly since your early days of mistaking rocks for predators and predators for rocks. Your communication is clear and calm, and you've developed the ability to work cooperatively with others without causing significant delays or complications. Competent, Grit announces at the end of the evaluation period. Not spectacular, not innovative, but reliably competent. You can be trusted to do the job without supervision, and you won't create additional problems that someone else has to solve. This assessment feels like faint praise until you realize that competent is actually a significant achievement in an environment where incompetence can be fatal for both yourself and others. You've graduated from being someone who requires constant monitoring to someone who can be trusted to contribute positively to group survival. The specialization process concludes with what amounts to a career counseling session, where the adults review your various assessments and help you understand where your skills might be most valuable to the group. Sentinel work seems like your strongest area. Sharp contributes. Good instincts, reliable attention, calm under pressure. With training, you could develop into a solid lookout. Adequate foraging skills, adds Scratch. Not exceptional, but sufficient for independence. Won't starve, won't slow down the group. Digging. Burrow pauses diplomatically. Well, everyone can't be an excavation specialist. What we're seeing, Grit summarizes, is someone who's developed into a reliable, steady contributor. You're not going to revolutionize Meerkat society, but you're also not going to accidentally get everyone killed through creative incompetence. In survival terms, that's actually quite valuable. You realize that you've achieved something you hadn't even known you were working toward. You've become unremarkable in the best possible way. You're no longer the juvenile who requires special attention and emergency intervention. You're just another member of the group, contributing to the collective effort of not dying with steady, unspectacular competence. The environmental mastery that accompanies this personal development is perhaps even more significant than the social achievement. You've begun to read the desert like a familiar book, understanding its moods and patterns with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from daily interaction with something that's trying to kill you. You know which winds bring the scent of distant rain and which carry only dust and disappointment. You can identify the subtle changes in light quality that suggest weather shifts, the way shadows fall differently when atmospheric pressure is changing, the particular silence that settles over the landscape before storms. The seasonal rhythms that once seemed arbitrary now make perfect sense. You understand why certain areas become productive, foraging grounds at specific times of year, why some water sources are reliable while others are seasonal, why migration routes follow particular patterns that balance food availability with safety considerations. You've developed opinions about termite mounds. The older ones provide better sight lines, but are more likely to be occupied by things with stingers. Water sources moving water is safer than standing water, but both require careful evaluation. And weather patterns, morning fog means good foraging conditions, but afternoon heat mirages can make threat assessment challenging. Your relationship with the landscape has evolved from fearful confusion to respectful understanding. The desert is still dangerous, still indifferent to your survival, but it's no longer a complete mystery. You've learned to work with its patterns rather than against them, to find opportunities within its constraints, to appreciate its harsh beauty, while maintaining a healthy respect for its lethal potential. You've learned to think like the desert, Grit observes one evening as you settle into your preferred position on a familiar termite mound for the final sentinel shift of the day. That's not something that can be taught. It has to be earned through time and attention and enough mistakes to develop real understanding. You survey the landscape that's become your world, the golden grass bending in the evening wind, the acacia trees casting long shadows in the slanted light, the complex topography of termite mounds and burrow entrances that represents home and safety and community. It's beautiful and deadly and utterly familiar, and you realize that somewhere along the way, you've stopped being a visitor in this environment and become a resident. The decision to expand territory comes during a council meeting that has the formal gravity of a corporate board meeting. If corporate board meetings were conducted by creatures whose business strategy primarily involved not being eaten. You're now senior enough to be included in these discussions, which feels significant until you realize that your primary contribution involves nodding thoughtfully, while adults make decisions based on information you're still learning to understand. The meeting takes place in the main chamber of the burrow system, a space that's been excavated and refined over several generations until it's achieved the kind of architectural efficiency that would impress urban planners if urban planners had to worry about structural integrity while being chased by things with teeth. Elder Sage, the mob's senior strategist, presents the situation with the kind of methodical analysis that comes from decades of successful survival decisions. She's reached the age where her opinions carry the weight of accumulated wisdom, and her assessments are listened to with the attention usually reserved for prophetic announcements. Our current territory is becoming overcrowded, she begins, settling into her preferred spot with the careful movements of someone whose joints have earned the right to protest about underground living. The foraging grounds are showing signs of overuse, and the competition for resources is beginning to affect our overall nutrition levels. This news isn't particularly surprising. You've noticed that hunting expeditions have been taking longer to produce satisfactory results, and the beetles in your familiar foraging areas have become notably more scarce and considerably more suspicious of meerkat activity. Additionally, Sage continues, the neighboring mob to the east has been expanding their range and beginning to encroach on areas we've traditionally considered our own. We need to either establish clearer boundaries or relocate to territory with better long-term potential. The discussion that follows involves the kind of strategic thinking that makes you appreciate how complex survival can be when you're responsible for an entire group rather than just yourself. Territory evaluation requires consideration of food availability, water sources, soil quality for burrow construction, proximity to escape routes, exposure to various types of predators, seasonal weather patterns, and the territorial claims of other meerkat mobs. Several scouts have been evaluating potential new areas, and they present their findings with the thoroughness of real estate agents specializing in property, where the primary consideration is likelihood of being eaten here. The first option is a grassland area, approximately 2 kilometers north of your current territory. It offers excellent foraging potential and good sightlines for sentinel work, but the soil composition makes burrow construction challenging, and it's within the hunting range of a family of caracals who've been increasingly active in the region. Good food sources, reports Scout, who's been conducting surveillance of the area for several weeks. Beetle population is healthy. Grub availability looks promising. Seasonal water access is reliable. However, the soil is quite rocky, which would make establishing a secure burrow system considerably more labor-intensive than our current situation. The second option is a more diverse landscape to the southwest, featuring a mixture of grassland and scrub forest that would provide varied foraging opportunities and excellent escape routes. The downside is that it's currently occupied by another meerkat mob who don't seem particularly interested in sharing. Territorial dispute would be inevitable, explains Patrol, who's been monitoring the boundaries of the southwestern territory. The current residents have been established there for at least 3 seasons, and they've invested significant effort in burrow construction and territorial marking. Relocation would require either negotiation or conflict, and they don't appear to be in a negotiating mood. The third option is the most intriguing, a territory to the southeast that offers excellent potential but requires a significant migration to reach. It's farther from your current home than the group has ever attempted to relocate, which adds logistical challenges to the already complex process of group movement. Long-term potential is exceptional, reports Range, who's conducted the most extensive survey of the distant territory. Food sources are diverse and abundant, water access is reliable year-round, soil conditions are ideal for burrow construction, and current predator activity is minimal. The challenge is the distance and the unknown factors we'd encounter during migration. The debate that follows involves the kind of risk assessment that makes you realize how much strategic thinking goes into decisions that seem straightforward from the outside. Moving territory isn't just about finding a better place to live, it's about successfully relocating an entire community while maintaining security, group cohesion, and operational capability throughout the transition process. Your own contribution to the discussion is limited but meaningful. As someone who's developed reliable sentinel skills, you're asked to evaluate the sightline potential of the various options based on the scout reports and your understanding of effective surveillance positioning. The Northern Territory would require establishing sentinel posts on artificial elevation. You contribute, trying to sound appropriately analytical. The termite mounds are well positioned, but the overall terrain is quite flat, which could create blind spots in threat detection. Elder Sage nods approvingly at this assessment, which makes you feel like you've successfully contributed something valuable to the decision-making process. The group settles on the southeastern option, despite the challenges it presents. The potential benefits outweigh the risks, and the consensus is that the current territory limitations require a bold solution rather than a cautious compromise. We'll proceed with systematic migration, Sage announces. Advanced scouts will establish waypoints and emergency shelter locations along the route. The main group will move in stages, maintaining security protocols throughout the transition. The actual migration process unfolds over several weeks and involves the kind of logistical complexity that would be impressive, even without considering that it's being coordinated by creatures whose primary tools are claws, determination. Advanced scouts establish a series of waypoints along the migration route, each featuring emergency shelter and reliable water access. These temporary bases are positioned a day's travel apart, allowing the main group to move in manageable stages while maintaining access to secure rest areas. Your role in the migration involves sentinel duty during the travel phases and security assessment of the waypoint locations. This responsibility feels significant in a way that your previous assignments haven't. You're contributing to decisions that affect the entire group's safety and success. The landscape changes dramatically as you move away from your familiar territory. The grasslands give way to more varied terrain featuring scattered acacia groves, rocky outcrops, and seasonal wetlands that create a complex mosaic of different environmental conditions. Each new area requires fresh threat assessment and adaptation to unfamiliar foraging conditions. The beetles here behave differently than those in your home territory. The bird populations include species you've never encountered before. Even the wind patterns carry different scents and sounds that require careful interpretation. The territorial dispute you'd been warned about materializes on the fourth day of migration, when your advanced scouts encounter a patrol from a neighboring mob who clearly consider your route to be an unacceptable intrusion on their territorial claims. The confrontation unfolds with the kind of ritualized formality that suggests both groups would prefer to resolve the situation without actual violence, but are prepared to escalate if diplomatic solutions prove inadequate. Representatives from both mobs meet at a neutral location, a large termite mound roughly equidistant from the territorial boundaries, for negotiations that resemble a very polite war, conducted entirely through posturing and strategic chittering. "We're conducting peaceful migration to unclaimed territory," explains Elder Sage, adopting the kind of formal tone usually reserved for important announcements. "Our route passes through this area briefly and temporarily, with no intention of establishing permanent presence or competing for local resources." The opposing delegation, led by a scarred veteran named Granite, who looks like he's survived several territorial disputes through a combination of competence and strategic intimidation, responds with the measured skepticism of someone who's heard similar claims before. "Migration routes can become permanent corridors," Granite observes. "Temporary presence can evolve into territorial expansion. We've seen this pattern before, and we're not particularly interested in repeating past mistakes." The negotiation process involves several hours of careful discussion about route modifications, timeline commitments, and mutual assurances about future territorial respect. Eventually, a compromise is reached that allows your group to continue the migration in exchange for specific commitments about timing and route restrictions. "Acceptable," Sage concludes. "We'll modify our route to avoid your core foraging areas and complete passage within the agreed timeframe." The resolution feels like a diplomatic victory, achieved through patience and strategic thinking rather than confrontation and conflict. You've witnessed international relations conducted at ground level, with stakes that are immediate and consequences that directly affect everyone's survival. The final phase of migration brings you into your new territory, and the change is immediately apparent. The landscape here is more diverse and complex than your previous home, featuring a variety of microenvironments that offer different opportunities and challenges. The grasslands are interspersed with patches of scrub forest that provide excellent cover and varied foraging options. Rocky outcrops create natural sentinel posts with exceptional sightlines. Seasonal streams provide reliable water access, and the soil composition is ideal for the kind of extensive burrow construction that creates secure, long-term home bases. Your first task in the new territory involves comprehensive security assessment of the area, identifying potential threats, locating optimal foraging sites, and establishing sentinel positions that provide effective surveillance coverage of the entire range. The work is challenging and engaging in ways that your previous routine hadn't been. Everything here is new and requires fresh evaluation. You're applying all your accumulated skills to a completely unfamiliar environment, learning to read new patterns and adapt to different conditions. The beetle populations here are more diverse than those in your previous territory, including species you've never encountered before. Some are more elusive than anything you're used to hunting, while others are surprisingly cooperative about being caught. The learning curve involves a lot of trial and error, but gradually you develop effective strategies for each new type of prey. The predator threats are different too. Instead of the caracals and jackals you're familiar with, this territory features ground hornbills, secretary birds, and occasionally, according to the scout reports, wild dogs that require entirely different defensive strategies. New territory means new rules, Sharp explains during your first Sentinel training session in the area. Everything you've learned still applies, but you'll need to adapt it to different conditions and different threats. The adaptation process is both challenging and satisfying. You're using established skills in novel situations, developing competence in unfamiliar circumstances, contributing to the group's success in an environment that offers better long-term prospects than your previous home. Several months into the settlement process, you realize that the migration has been successful beyond the original expectations. The territory provides abundant resources, the burrow construction has progressed efficiently, and the group has adapted to the new environment with minimal complications. Good decision, you comment to Elder Sage during one of your regular territory assessment conversations. Experience, she replies with the satisfied tone of someone whose strategic planning has proven successful. Learning to evaluate risk versus potential, understanding when change is necessary rather than optional, recognizing opportunity when it presents itself. You've been part of a major territorial expansion that required strategic planning, diplomatic negotiation, and successful adaptation to entirely new environmental conditions. Your contribution to this achievement feels meaningful in ways that your previous accomplishments haven't. You've helped ensure the long-term success and security of your entire community. The drought begins subtly, which is perhaps the most insidious thing about it. Natural disasters, you've always assumed, should announce themselves with appropriate drama. Sudden storms, obvious catastrophes, the kind of unmistakable environmental violence that gives you clear warning that your survival strategies are about to be tested. Instead, this crisis creeps up with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and knows you don't. It starts with the usual seasonal dry period, extending just slightly longer than normal. The rains that typically arrive with the precision of a well-maintained schedule are delayed by days, then weeks, then long enough that the adults begin having the kind of quietly serious conversations that suggest concern without yet admitting to actual worry. You first notice the change in the quality of the grass. The golden color that usually indicates healthy dormancy begins shifting toward a brittle brown that speaks of stress rather than seasonal rest. The leaves on the acacia trees develop a wilted quality that persists even in the cooler morning hours, and the soil develops a hardened crust that makes digging significantly more difficult. The beetle populations respond to these changes before the meerkats do. Your usual foraging areas begin producing smaller yields, and the grubs that were reliably available at specific depths either disappear entirely or retreat so far underground that finding them requires excavation projects that consume more energy than the nutritional reward justifies. Temporary setback, Elder Sage announces during the first official acknowledgement of the developing situation. Seasonal variations happen periodically. We'll adjust our foraging strategies and wait for conditions to normalize. The adjustment process involves expanding the range of acceptable food sources to include items that were previously considered emergency rations. The bitter roots that you learn to tolerate during your first winter become regular menu items. Seeds that require extensive processing to become digestible are gathered and prepared with the kind of systematic efficiency usually reserved for industrial food production. Water management becomes a daily consideration rather than an occasional concern. The seasonal streams that provided reliable access dry up first, requiring longer expeditions to reach the permanent water sources that become increasingly precious as the drought extends into its second month. These expeditions take on the character of military operations, with careful planning for security, route selection, and resource allocation. Water access sites become potential conflict zones as various animal populations compete for access to dwindling supplies, requiring diplomatic skills and strategic timing to avoid dangerous confrontations. You participate in these water missions with the kind of focused attention that comes from understanding that mistakes in resource management can have consequences that extend far beyond personal discomfort. The trips require traveling farther from secure territory, often into areas where the predator populations are also feeling the stress of resource scarcity, and maybe making survival decisions that don't prioritize the continued existence of small mammals. The social dynamics within your own group begin showing the strain of extended resource limitation. Personalities that were merely annoying during times of abundance become genuinely problematic when everyone's operating with reduced energy reserves and elevated stress levels. Pip, whose nervousness was previously just a personal quirk, develops a tendency toward panic that becomes contagious during group activities. His anxiety about food scarcity leads to hoarding behaviors that undermine the cooperative resource sharing that's essential for group survival during crisis conditions. Squeaks becomes territorial about his foraging discoveries in ways that would be considered antisocial under normal circumstances, but edge toward dangerous when resources are genuinely scarce. His reluctance to share information about productive digging sites creates inefficiencies that the group can't afford when every calorie matters. Even Tumble, usually the most cooperative member of your peer group, begins showing signs of stress-induced irritability that manifest as criticism of others' foraging techniques and complaints about work assignments that were previously accepted without question. The adults handle these developing personality conflicts with the kind of firm patience that suggests they've seen this pattern before and understand that crisis situations bring out both the best and worst in everyone. Elder Sage addresses the group tensions directly, with the kind of straightforward communication that cuts through individual drama to focus on collective survival. Stress makes everything harder, she explains during a group meeting that has the formal tone of a crisis management briefing. Including getting along with each other, we can either waste energy on interpersonal conflicts, or we can focus that energy on getting through this situation successfully. The choice is individual, but the consequences affect everyone. Your own response to the developing crisis involves a kind of methodical stubbornness that surprises you. The environmental challenges that would have overwhelmed you during your juvenile period now feel like problems that require systematic solutions rather than occasions for panic. You develop more efficient foraging techniques that maximize energy return while minimizing expenditure. Your sentinel work becomes more focused and strategic, concentrating on threats that are likely to be encountered by stressed and potentially desperate wildlife, rather than the routine predator activity of normal conditions. The environmental changes continue, with the relentless persistence of a natural process that's indifferent to the survival requirements of individual creatures. The landscape begins taking on an alien quality as familiar landmarks change their appearance under the stress of extended drought. Termite mounds that previously provided reliable elevation for sentinel work develop cracks and structural weaknesses that make them unsafe for climbing. The root systems of the acacia trees become exposed as the soil retreats, creating a network of underground architecture that's both fascinating and slightly ominous. The sky takes on a different quality, with a harsh brightness that seems to leach color from everything beneath it. The air becomes dry enough to make breathing noticeably more difficult, and dust storms become frequent enough to interfere with both foraging activities and threat detection systems. Wildlife behavior throughout the region begins showing the effects of resource competition and environmental stress. The bird populations that usually maintain predictable patterns start appearing in unexpected locations and at unusual times, as traditional food sources become unreliable. Predator activity increases in both frequency and desperation. Creatures that would normally avoid areas with established meerkat populations begin taking risks that suggest their usual hunting grounds are no longer providing adequate returns. Your sentinel duties become significantly more demanding as the threat assessment requirements expand to include animals that are behaving outside their normal behavioral patterns. The crisis reaches its peak during the 4th month, when the environmental conditions have degraded to the point where basic survival requires the kind of daily resource management usually associated with wartime rationing. Every expedition beyond the burrow system requires careful calculation of energy expenditure versus potential return, and contingency planning for scenarios that were previously considered unlikely emergencies. Food rationing becomes formalized rather than voluntary, with Elder Sage implementing distribution systems that ensure basic nutritional requirements are met for all group members while maintaining reserves for emergency situations. The process requires the kind of mathematical precision that makes you appreciate how complex resource management becomes when survival margins are narrow. Water expeditions are reduced to essential trips only, with careful coordination to ensure that multiple groups don't attempt access to the same sources simultaneously. The diplomatic protocols for sharing water access with other animal populations become increasingly important as territorial boundaries blur under the pressure of mutual need. Your role during this peak crisis period involves taking on responsibilities that would have been beyond your capabilities during earlier phases of your development. You lead foraging expeditions to areas that require advanced threat assessment skills, coordinate water access missions that involve complex security considerations, and provide sentinel coverage during group activities that carry elevated risk levels. The work is demanding and occasionally dangerous, but it's also deeply satisfying in ways that your previous routine assignments hadn't been. You're contributing essential services during conditions when competence isn't just valued but necessary for group survival. Your skills, developed through years of gradual learning and practice, are being tested under circumstances where mistakes have serious consequences. The resolution of the drought crisis comes gradually, with the same lack of dramatic announcement that characterized its beginning. The first signs of change appear in the behavior of the insect populations, which begin showing increased activity levels that suggest improved environmental conditions even before the visible landscape starts recovering. The rains, when they finally arrive, come with the kind of intensity that seems designed to compensate for months of absence. The initial storms are brief but powerful, transforming the hardened soil into temporarily muddy terrain that makes travel challenging but signals the beginning of environmental recovery. The grass responds to the moisture with what can only be described as enthusiasm, shifting from brittle brown to hopeful green within days of the first substantial rainfall. The acacia trees begin producing new leaves with the kind of vigorous growth that suggests they've been waiting for exactly this opportunity to demonstrate their resilience. Beetle populations rebound with surprising speed, as if they've been hiding underground waiting for conditions to improve. Your familiar foraging areas become productive again, and the excavation work that had become exhaustingly difficult returns to manageable effort levels. The group dynamics that had become strained during the peak crisis period gradually normalize as resource pressure decreases and energy levels improve. Personalities that had become problematic under stress return to their usual quirks and mannerisms, and the cooperative behaviors that define successful meerkat social organization reassert themselves. Crisis management, Elder Sage observes during the first post-drought group meeting, reveals character in ways that normal conditions don't. Everyone's response to resource limitation and environmental stress provides useful information about their potential contributions during future challenging situations. You realize that you've successfully completed your first major test of everything you've learned about survival, resource management, group cooperation, and crisis response. The skills that were developed during routine conditions proved adequate for extreme circumstances, and your contributions to the group's survival efforts were meaningful rather than merely supportive. The drought has also provided you with a deeper understanding of your own resilience and adaptability. The environmental challenges that would have overwhelmed you during your juvenile period were met with systematic problem-solving and steady persistence. You've discovered that you're tougher and more resourceful than you'd previously had occasion to realize. More importantly, you've learned that successful survival during crisis conditions depends more on community cooperation and systematic resource management than on individual heroics or dramatic gestures. The solutions that proved effective were methodical, collaborative, and based on accumulated knowledge rather than innovative techniques or exceptional individual performance. The experience has also given you a new appreciation for the complex relationship between environmental conditions and social dynamics. Resource scarcity affects not just individual survival strategies, but the entire framework of group interactions, territorial management, and interspecies diplomacy that governs life in the desert ecosystem. As the landscape continues, its recovery and normal foraging routines are gradually re-established. You find yourself viewing your environment with a deeper understanding of its cycles, limitations, and potential for both abundance and scarcity. The desert that had seemed stable and predictable now reveals itself as a dynamic system, capable of dramatic changes that require constant adaptation and flexible response strategies. You've survived your first major drought, contributed meaningfully to your group's crisis management efforts, and discovered that competence developed during routine conditions can be successfully applied to extreme circumstances. The experience has been educational, challenging, and ultimately confidence-building in ways that will inform your approach to future survival challenges. The moment you realize you've become someone who gives advice rather than someone who needs it happens on a morning when you're watching a group of new juveniles attempt to master the basic skills you remember struggling with not so long ago. The sight of their enthusiastic incompetence triggers a complex emotional response that combines nostalgia, mild horror, and the dawning understanding that you've apparently accumulated enough experience to be considered a source of wisdom. The juveniles in question are this season's crop of recently surfaced youngsters, a collection of energetic disasters who approach basic survival tasks with the kind of confident optimism that suggests they haven't yet fully grasped the concept that everything in their environment is specifically designed to kill them. There's Bounce, whose name was earned through an incident involving over-enthusiastic foraging and a spectacular collision with a termite mound. Her approach to hunting involves a level of kinetic energy that would be impressive if it occasionally resulted in actually catching prey, rather than just rearranging the local geography. Chirp has developed a communication style that involves making noise constantly, apparently under the impression that volume can compensate for accuracy in alarm calling. His alerts tend to feature a lot of enthusiasm and very little useful information, creating a situation where the group receives frequent announcements about threats that may or may not exist in locations that are described with admirable creativity but questionable precision. Then there's Slip, who has elevated clumsiness to an art form and seems capable of finding innovative ways to fall down on even the flattest terrain. Her excavation technique involves more accidental self-burial than intentional hole digging, and her foraging success rate makes your own juvenile performance look efficient by comparison. "Right," says Grit, approaching you with the weary expression of someone who's been assigned to manage this educational catastrophe. "You're going to help with juvenile training." This announcement comes as something of a surprise, since you still think of yourself as someone who's recently graduated from needing constant supervision rather than someone qualified to provide it. The transition from student to teacher apparently happens without official notification, marked only by the gradual realization that you've stopped making the kinds of mistakes that require adult intervention. "Training in what exactly?" you ask, hoping the answer involves something you're actually competent at rather than just something you're marginally less terrible at than the current juveniles. "Basic survival skills," Grit explains with the patient tone of someone who's had this conversation many times before. "Foraging techniques, threat recognition, communication protocols, the fundamental knowledge required to avoid becoming someone else's lunch through preventable stupidity." Your first lesson with the juveniles takes place in what's optimistically described as a controlled learning environment, and what looks more like a patch of relatively safe terrain where mistakes won't immediately result in catastrophic consequences. The goal is to teach basic foraging principles using live demonstration and hands-on practice, which sounds straightforward, until you begin attempting to explain concepts that you've internalized through years of repetitive trial and error. "The key to successful foraging," you begin, settling into what you hope is an authoritative teaching posture, "is understanding what you're looking for and where you're likely to find it." The juveniles listen with the kind of focused attention that suggests they're genuinely interested in learning, which is both encouraging and terrifying, since it means they're depending on you to provide information that could affect their continued existence. "Beetles," you continue, "prefer specific soil conditions and shelter arrangements. You want to look for areas where the ground moisture and soil composition create favorable habitats. You demonstrate the technique by examining a promising patch of terrain, pointing out the subtle indicators that suggest productive digging, soil texture, vegetation patterns, evidence of insect activity, and the kind of environmental signs that experienced foragers learn to recognize automatically. Bounce immediately rushes off to begin enthusiastic excavation in a spot that displays none of the characteristics you've just described, apparently having concluded that the demonstration phase has ended and it's time to begin applying the lessons through vigorous but misdirected effort. "Not there," you call, hurrying after her before she can dig herself into a situation that requires rescue operations. "Remember what we discussed about soil indicators?" "It looks fine to me," Bounce replies, continuing her excavation with undiminished enthusiasm. "Dirt is dirt, right?" This response makes you realize that teaching involves more than just explaining techniques. It requires helping students understand why the techniques work, what happens when they don't work, and how to recognize the difference between productive effort and energetic futility. "Soil composition matters," you explain, demonstrating the difference between the compacted, beetle-friendly earth of a good foraging site and the loose, sandy terrain that Bounce has chosen. Different soil types support different types of prey. What you're digging in now is mostly sand, which doesn't retain the kind of moisture that grubs need to survive. Chirp, meanwhile, has been practicing his alarm calls with the kind of dedication that would be admirable if his technique showed any improvement, rather than just getting louder. His attempts at the aerial predator approaching call sound like someone trying to communicate through a broken musical instrument, conveying urgency without any useful information about the nature or location of the supposed threat. Communication clarity, you tell him, is more important than volume. The group needs to understand what you're warning about and where the danger is located. "But I'm being really loud," Chirp protests. "Everyone can definitely hear me." "Yes, you agree. They can hear you, but they can't understand you, which means your warning isn't actually helping anyone make good survival decisions." The process of breaking down alarm calling into teachable components makes you appreciate how complex even basic communication becomes when accuracy can mean the difference between appropriate caution and unnecessary panic. Each call requires specific pitch, rhythm, and tonal qualities that convey essential information about threat, type, location, distance, and urgency level. Slip's excavation attempts, meanwhile, demonstrate that it's possible to put significant effort into digging without actually moving appreciable amounts of earth in productive directions. Her technique involves a lot of energetic scratching that mostly results in her getting buried in the debris from her own excavation work. Digging efficiency, you explain, helping her extract herself from her latest self-created predicament, involves understanding soil mechanics and working with natural structural patterns rather than just moving dirt around randomly. "I'm trying," Slip says, spitting sand and looking discouraged. "It just seems like the ground doesn't want to cooperate." This comment makes you realize that one of the most important lessons you can share involves the relationship between persistence and technique. Effort alone isn't sufficient for success. It needs to be directed effort, applied consistently, with adjustments based on feedback and results. Over the following weeks, your teaching role expands beyond basic skills demonstration to include crisis management, confidence building, and the kind of patient repetition that transforms initial confusion into gradual competence. The juveniles begin showing improvement, though their learning curves vary significantly in both speed and direction. Bounce eventually learns to channel her enthusiasm into more productive applications, developing a foraging style that combines high energy with improved accuracy. Her excavation technique still involves more physical drama than strictly necessary, but she begins successfully locating prey with enough consistency to sustain herself independently. Chirp's communication skills improve through systematic practice and feedback, gradually evolving from volume-based noise production to information-rich alerts that actually help rather than merely announcing his presence. His breakthrough comes when he successfully coordinates group response to an actual threat, providing clear, accurate warnings that enable effective defensive action. Slip's coordination improves through repetition and the kind of gradual muscle memory development that transforms conscious effort into automatic competence. Her digging becomes more efficient as she learns to work with soil patterns rather than against them, and her foraging success rate climbs from occasionally accidental to reliably intentional. The teaching process also provides you with unexpected insights into your own development and accumulated knowledge. Explaining techniques to others requires understanding not just how to perform skills, but why they work, what can go wrong, and how to troubleshoot problems when standard approaches aren't producing expected results. You realize that experience really is just a polite word for having survived being stupid long enough to develop better judgment. The mistakes that seemed catastrophic when you were making them now serve as useful teaching examples, demonstrating both what not to do and how to recover from inevitable errors. The most important thing, you tell the juveniles during one of your regular training sessions, is understanding that competence develops gradually. Everyone starts out terrible at everything. The goal isn't to be perfect immediately. It's to be slightly less terrible each day until you eventually achieve the kind of reliable mediocrity that keeps you alive. This philosophy proves more encouraging to struggling students than inspirational speeches about excellence and achievement. The juveniles begin approaching their learning with more realistic expectations and better persistence when initial attempts don't produce immediate success. Your own confidence as a mentor grows through accumulated positive feedback and the satisfaction of watching students develop from helpless disaster magnets into competent contributors to group survival. The patience required for effective teaching develops alongside your technical expertise, creating a teaching style that balances encouragement with realistic assessment. Good teaching, Grit observes during one of your progress evaluations, requires understanding how people learn, not just knowing what they need to learn. You're developing the ability to adapt your instruction to individual learning styles and needs. The seasonal cycle continues around your teaching activities, bringing new challenges and opportunities for practical education. Winter scarcity provides lessons in resource management and adaptation strategies. Spring abundance offers chances to practice advanced techniques without the pressure of subsistence-level resource acquisition. You begin to understand the continuity that connects each generation to the next, the way accumulated knowledge passes from experienced adults to developing juveniles through patient instruction and guided practice. Your own learning, which had seemed like an individual struggle for competence, now reveals itself as part of a larger educational tradition that ensures group survival across changing environmental conditions. The environmental knowledge that you've acquired through years of daily interaction with the desert ecosystem becomes a teaching resource that helps juveniles develop the kind of environmental literacy that transforms survival from desperate improvisation into systematic adaptation. You pass on not just techniques but understanding, the why behind the how that enables independent problem solving, rather than just rote repetition of learned behaviors. By the end of your first formal teaching season, you've successfully guided 3 juveniles from complete incompetence to basic self-sufficiency. They're not exceptional performers, but they're no longer actively dangerous to themselves or others, which represents a significant achievement in the context of Meerkat education. Successful mentorship, Elder Sage tells you during your end-of-season review, is measured not by the brilliance of your students but by their ability to survive independently and contribute positively to group welfare. You've achieved that goal with consistency and patience. You realize that teaching has become more than just a responsibility assigned by the adults. It's developed into a source of personal satisfaction and professional identity. You found meaning in helping others avoid the mistakes you made, in passing on knowledge that enhances group survival, in contributing to the educational tradition that maintains community resilience across generations. The juveniles who were once your students begin taking on more advanced responsibilities, gradually transitioning from supervised learners to independent contributors. Watching their continued development provides the kind of long-term satisfaction that comes from knowing your efforts have produced lasting positive results. You've become someone who gives advice rather than someone who needs it, someone whose experience is valued rather than someone whose enthusiasm requires careful management. The transition happened gradually, marked not by dramatic events, but by the accumulated weight of countless small competencies that eventually added up to wisdom worth sharing. The morning you realize that other meerkats are looking to you for decisions is the morning you understand that competence, once achieved, comes with the kind of responsibilities you hadn't fully considered when you were working so hard to achieve it. You're participating in a routine territory patrol when Ranger, one of the younger adults, encounters a situation that requires immediate judgment and turns to you with the expectant expression of someone who assumes you'll know what to do. The situation involves a section of territory boundary where recent heavy rains have created new water pooling that's attracted both increased insect activity and the attention of a family of ground squirrels who appear to be considering permanent relocation. The question is whether this represents an opportunity for expanded foraging or a territorial intrusion that requires diplomatic intervention. What do you think? Ranger asks, settling beside you on a termite mound that provides good sight lines over the disputed area. They're not exactly competing for the same resources we use, but they're definitely establishing residence in what we've considered our territory. The fact that Ranger is asking for your opinion rather than making his own decision or consulting with Elder Sage represents a shift in group dynamics that you're not entirely prepared for. Somewhere in the gradual accumulation of competence and experience, you've apparently crossed an invisible threshold that marks the difference between reliable group member and someone whose judgment matters. You study the situation with the kind of systematic analysis that's become automatic after years of similar assessments. The ground squirrels are focused on areas where our foraging activities don't typically concentrate. Their presence might actually be beneficial, since their digging could expose grub populations that we wouldn't normally access. On the other hand, permanent residence by another species could attract predators or create competition for water access during drier periods. Limited territorial overlap, you conclude after considering the various factors involved. Their resource requirements don't directly conflict with ours, and their digging activity might actually improve foraging opportunities in that sector. I'd recommend establishing monitoring protocols rather than immediate intervention. Ranger nods thoughtfully, apparently satisfied with this assessment. Makes sense. Keep an eye on the situation, see how it develops, intervene only if their presence starts creating actual problems for our operations. This interaction establishes a pattern that develops over the following weeks. Your opinions begin carrying weight in group discussions about territory management, resource allocation, and strategic planning. The adults start including you in decision-making processes, not just as a participant, but as someone whose input influences outcomes. The transition from follower to leader happens gradually, marked by increasing requests for your assessment of situations that require experienced judgment. Your role in group activities shifts from executing decisions made by others to participating in the process of making those decisions in the first place. The responsibility feels both flattering and terrifying, particularly when you realize that your recommendations affect not just your own survival but the welfare of the entire group. The casual confidence you developed in your own competence becomes tempered by awareness of the consequences when competence is applied to decisions that matter to others. Your first major leadership test comes during a territorial dispute that requires both diplomatic skill and strategic thinking. A neighboring mob has begun expanding their range into areas that overlap with your group's traditional foraging territory, creating a situation that could escalate into serious conflict if not handled with appropriate care. The dispute centers around a particularly productive foraging area that both groups have used seasonally, but neither has claimed as exclusive territory. Recent changes in regional beetle populations have made this area more valuable than it was previously, and both mobs are interested in establishing more permanent access rights. Elder Sage assigns you to lead the diplomatic mission that will attempt to negotiate a resolution before the situation deteriorates into the kind of territorial conflict that produces casualties and long-term hostility between neighboring groups. Diplomatic experience, she explains during your pre-mission briefing, is essential for senior group members. You've demonstrated good judgment in resource assessment and conflict analysis. This situation will test your ability to apply those skills to intergroup relations. The negotiation takes place at a neutral location, roughly equidistant from both territorial centers, with delegations from each group meeting under the kind of formal protocols that have evolved to prevent diplomatic discussions from turning into actual combat. Your counterpart from the opposing mob is an experienced negotiator named Ridge, whose scarred coat suggests extensive experience with territorial disputes, and whose calm demeanor indicates confidence in his ability to achieve favorable outcomes through discussion, rather than violence. Overlapping resource interests. Ridge begins, adopting the formal tone that characterizes intergroup diplomacy. Both groups have historical claims to seasonal use of the disputed area. Current beetle population increases have made exclusive access more valuable to both parties. The negotiation process requires balancing your group's legitimate interests with the recognition that the opposing mob also has reasonable claims to the territory in question. The goal is finding a solution that provides both groups with adequate access to the resources they need, while avoiding the kind of territorial conflict that would be costly for everyone involved. Seasonal rotation, you propose after considering the various options available. Alternate access periods that allow both groups to benefit from the resource concentration without direct competition or territorial overlap during usage periods. Ridge considers this suggestion with the kind of careful analysis that suggests he's evaluating both the practical implications and the diplomatic precedent it would establish. Acceptable framework, he concludes. Specific scheduling and boundary protocols would need to be negotiated, but the basic concept addresses both groups' resource requirements without creating permanent territorial conflicts. The detailed negotiations that follow involve the kind of complex logistics that make you appreciate how much strategic thinking goes into successful resource management. Access schedules need to account for seasonal variations in beetle activity, weather patterns that affect foraging efficiency, and the movement patterns of predators who might take advantage of predictable meerkat activity in specific locations. The final agreement establishes a rotating access system that provides both groups with adequate foraging opportunities while minimizing the potential for conflict or resource depletion. The success of these negotiations enhances your reputation as someone capable of handling complex diplomatic situations with skill and patience. Your growing leadership role also involves conflict resolution within your own group, mediating disputes that arise from the normal friction of community life. These situations require understanding not just the immediate disagreement, but the underlying dynamics that created the conflict and the long-term relationship management necessary for maintaining group cohesion. When Pip and Squeaks develop a disagreement about foraging territory allocation that threatens to become a permanent source of group tension, you find yourself in the position of mediating a solution that addresses both their individual concerns and the group's need for cooperative resource management. The mediation process requires patience, diplomatic skill, and the kind of insight into personality dynamics that comes from years of observing how different individuals respond to stress, competition, and resource pressure. The resolution involves both practical adjustments to territorial assignments and the kind of face-saving compromises that allow everyone to accept the outcome without feeling like they've lost important status or resources. Effective leadership, Elder Sage observes, during one of your regular performance assessments, involves understanding that most conflicts arise from reasonable concerns that haven't been adequately addressed, rather than from fundamental incompatibility between group members. Your approach to conflict resolution demonstrates both analytical skill and social understanding. The environmental mastery that accompanies your leadership development represents perhaps the most significant achievement of this period. You've learned to read weather patterns with the kind of accuracy that allows you to predict resource availability, potential threats, and optimal timing for various group activities. Your understanding of seasonal cycles now extends beyond simple pattern recognition to include the complex interactions between climate, prey populations, predator activity, and territorial dynamics that determine success or failure in desert survival. You can anticipate beetle emergence patterns, predict water availability during different phases of the seasonal cycle, and identify environmental changes that signal opportunities or dangers for group welfare. This environmental literacy becomes a resource that benefits the entire group, providing strategic advantages in planning and decision-making that improve overall survival success rates. Your ability to predict and prepare for changing conditions contributes to group resilience and adaptation capabilities that enhance long-term viability in an unpredictable environment. You've achieved the kind of competence that makes you practically superhuman by meerkat standards. Someone who can be trusted to make good decisions under pressure, handle complex diplomatic situations, resolve interpersonal conflicts, and provide reliable environmental assessment that improves group survival prospects. The journey from juvenile liability to senior leader represents a transformation that feels both gradual and dramatic, marked by accumulated competencies that eventually add up to genuine expertise. The perfect day arrives without announcement, like most perfect things do, quietly, unpretentiously, and with the kind of understated grace that makes you realize that excellence doesn't require drama, just the subtle alignment of competence, opportunity, and favorable circumstances. It begins before dawn, with you taking the early sentinel shift on your preferred termite mound, as the sky transitions from black to deep blue to the pale gold that suggests clear weather and good visibility. The air carries the crisp clarity that comes after recent rain, when dust has settled and scents travel with unusual precision. Your surveillance of the territory reveals the kind of peaceful activity that indicates a well-functioning ecosystem. Normal bird behavior, predictable small mammal movement patterns, and the absence of the tension that accompanies predator presence. The beetles are active but not panicked. The grass moves only with wind rather than with creatures trying to avoid being seen, and the overall environmental mood suggests a day when survival will involve routine competence rather than crisis management. The foraging expedition you lead to the northeastern sector proceeds with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from experienced teamwork and favorable conditions. The beetle populations are cooperative, the digging is productive, and the weather remains ideal for extended outdoor activity. Your route selection proves optimal, taking the group through areas where recent rain has softened the soil without creating muddy conditions that would complicate excavation work. The timing allows access to foraging sites during peak insect activity periods, and your threat assessment proves accurate. No predators encountered, no territorial disputes, no environmental hazards requiring emergency response protocols. Bounce, now considerably more competent than during her juvenile training period, successfully locates and excavates a cache of grubs with the kind of methodical technique that demonstrates real learning has occurred. Her excavation work is efficient and productive, requiring minimal supervision and producing results that contribute meaningfully to the group's nutritional requirements. Chirp's sentinel work during the foraging expedition demonstrates how much his communication skills have improved. His alerts are clear, accurate, and appropriately calibrated to the actual threat levels encountered. When he spots a secretary bird at considerable distance, his warning provides adequate time for the group to take appropriate precautions without creating unnecessary panic about a threat that proves to be manageable through routine defensive positioning. Even Slip, whose coordination had been a source of ongoing concern, navigates the terrain without significant mishaps and contributes to the group's foraging success through steady, careful work that demonstrates the value of persistence and systematic skill development. The return journey proceeds without complications, following optimal routes that balance efficiency with security considerations. Your navigation choices prove sound, the weather remains favorable, and the group maintains good formation and communication throughout the transit back to home territory. The afternoon involves routine territorial maintenance that proceeds with unusual smoothness. Water access is straightforward, with adequate supplies available at the primary source, and no competition from other species requiring diplomatic management. The burrow system requires only minor maintenance work, and the overall territory assessment reveals no developing problems that require immediate attention. Your evening sentinel shift provides an opportunity to appreciate the landscape that's become intimately familiar through years of daily observation. The late afternoon light transforms the golden grass into something approaching artistic beauty, and the play of shadows across the complex topography of termite mounds and acacia groves creates the kind of visual harmony that makes you understand why some creatures choose to live in environments that are trying to kill them. The sunset, when it arrives, features the kind of spectacular color display that the Kalahari produces when atmospheric conditions align properly. The sky progresses through shades of gold, orange, and deep red that reflect off the grass and create a landscape that appears to be constructed entirely from precious metals and jewels. From your sentinel position, you can observe the entire territory that your group calls home. The foraging areas where you've learned to find food, the water sources that provide reliable access to survival necessities, the burrow entrances that represent security and community, and the network of pathways that connect all these elements into a comprehensive survival system. The view encompasses not just physical geography, but the accumulated history of your development, from helpless juvenile to competent adult, from someone who required constant supervision to someone whose judgment influences group decisions, from liability to asset in the complex social organization that makes survival possible in this harsh environment. The night shift transition proceeds without complications, with your relief arriving promptly and the handoff of surveillance responsibilities completed with the kind of professional efficiency that indicates a well-functioning system operated by experienced personnel. As you settle into the burrow for the evening, you realize that the day has been perfect, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because everything ordinary happened exactly as it should. Competence applied consistently to routine challenges produced exactly the kind of unremarkable success that represents the highest achievement in survival terms. Success in meerkat terms, you understand, means nobody died on your watch, no crises required emergency intervention, and the group's long-term survival prospects were enhanced rather than diminished by the day's activities. It's the kind of boring excellence that you've spent years learning to achieve, and that represents the most meaningful accomplishment possible in an environment where dramatic events are usually synonymous with things going terribly wrong. The satisfaction that accompanies this realization is quiet but profound. The contentment that comes from understanding that you've become exactly what you needed to become, someone whose competence contributes to community welfare and whose presence makes survival more likely rather than more complicated for everyone around you. The caracal appears on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat has settled into the golden intensity that makes everything shimmer, and the shadows have shortened to small pools of relief beneath the acacia trees. You're leading a foraging expedition in the southeastern sector, when Chirp's alert cuts through the drowsy warmth with the kind of urgency that transforms routine activity into immediate crisis management. Large predator, northwestern approach, moving with purpose toward our position. Chirp reports with the calm precision that marks him as significantly more competent than the juvenile who used to communicate threats through volume rather than accuracy. Your response is automatic and systematic, drawing on years of training and experience that have prepared you for exactly this kind of situation. The first priority is group coordination, ensuring that everyone receives clear instructions and understands their role in the defensive response that's about to unfold. Defensive positions. You call, using the tone that conveys authority without panic. Eastern bolt holes, standard predator protocol, maintain visual contact but prioritize concealment. The group responds with the kind of smooth efficiency that indicates extensive practice and confidence in leadership. There's no confusion, no hesitation, no waste of movement that could compromise security or create additional vulnerabilities during a situation that's already challenging enough. From your position behind a termite mound that provides both cover and elevated sight lines, you spot the caracal as it emerges from the scrub vegetation approximately 60 meters from your location. It's a large adult, moving with the kind of focused determination that suggests it's hunting rather than simply traveling through the area. The caracal's behavior indicates that it's detected meerkat presence and is actively pursuing prey rather than opportunistically investigating interesting scents. Its movement pattern is systematic and deliberate, suggesting experience with hunting small mammals and familiarity with meerkat defensive strategies. Your threat assessment reveals several concerning factors. The predator is approaching from upwind, which means it's been tracking scent rather than relying on chance encounter. Its size and condition suggest a successful hunter capable of taking multiple prey items, and its approach route indicates tactical thinking rather than random predation behavior. The environmental factors present both advantages and challenges for defensive response. The recent rain has softened the ground, which makes rapid excavation of emergency shelters more feasible, but also increases the risk of burrow collapse during hasty construction. The vegetation provides excellent concealment opportunities, but limits visibility for ongoing threat assessment. Coordinated withdrawal, you decide, evaluating the options available and selecting the strategy that offers the best combination of safety and tactical flexibility. Maintain formation, use available cover, sequential movement to secondary defensive positions. The withdrawal proceeds with the kind of choreographed precision that comes from extensive practice and mutual trust in team capabilities. Each group member moves according to practice protocols, maintaining visual contact with designated partners while advancing toward more secure positions. The caracal adjusts its approach in response to the group's movement, demonstrating the kind of tactical adaptability that makes experienced predators particularly dangerous. Instead of pursuing directly, it begins attempting to outflank the withdrawal route, seeking to cut off access to the primary escape routes. This behavior requires immediate tactical adjustment and the kind of leadership decision-making that determines success or failure during high-stakes situations. Your options include accelerating the withdrawal to reach secure positions before the caracal can complete its flanking maneuver, or shifting to more aggressive defensive tactics that involve coordinated group harassment designed to discourage predator pursuit. Harassment protocol. You announce, recognizing that the caracal's tactical approach requires active response rather than passive evasion. Coordinated alerts, maintain distance, create sensory overload to discourage continued pursuit. The group responds immediately, implementing the coordinated defense strategy that involves multiple individuals providing loud, continuous alarm calls from concealed positions while maintaining safe distances from the predator. The technique is designed to create confusion and stress that makes continued hunting more difficult and less appealing than seeking prey elsewhere. Chirp takes point on the harassment campaign, using refined communication to issue clear, continuous alerts of both warning and defiance. Bounce and slip flank from multiple directions, maintaining alarm calls and remaining ready to retreat if needed. The caracal, showing experience, doesn't flee immediately. Instead, it assesses whether the effort of pursuing such coordinated prey is worth it. The standoff lasts several tense minutes. Your group remains organized, focused, and tactically aware, without panicking or scattering. Eventually, the caracal decides it's not worth the trouble. It retreats with a calm that suggests respect rather than defeat. Threat withdrawal confirmed, Chirp reports. The post-encounter debrief highlights what made the defense effective. Not heroics, but discipline, teamwork, and experience-based decision-making. You tell the group, this is how organized resistance works through competence, not chaos. What follows isn't celebration, but a quiet sense of pride. You protected the group through leadership, not luck. It's another successful moment in a growing archive of competence. That encounter becomes part of your leadership memory, a case study in turning danger into a controlled situation. It reinforces a lesson you've come to embody. Preparation and practice are everything. As another full seasonal cycle passes, you realize how deeply you've internalized the rhythm of desert life. You no longer just endure the seasons, you anticipate, adapt, and teach others how to do the same. Spring brings green abundance, and with it, eager juveniles experiencing their first boom in resources. Teaching them now feels natural, not burdensome. Spring, you explain, isn't just for enjoying plenty, it's for preparing for what comes after. In foraging zones rich with beetles, you demonstrate advanced techniques to turn abundance into reserves. The youngsters are enthusiastic but inexperienced. You guide them, passing on efficiency strategies learned through years of trial and error. Summer heat arrives not as a threat, but a challenge you've mastered. You know the reliable water sources, best times to move, and how to maintain productivity. Sentinel duty adapts with the season. Heat distorts visibility and affects communication, but you've learned to compensate through subtle environmental cues. Autumn arrives with fading abundance. You help your students shift their mindset from easy foraging to resource conservation. This season tests your balance between energy use and preparation. You tell them, modeling careful efficiency in every hunt. When winter returns, survival is no longer your only concern. You now guard group welfare planning, preventing conflicts, and keeping morale steady during scarcity. Your calm leadership keeps everyone together under pressure. By spring, you've shifted from reacting to challenges to anticipating them. You've become the meerkat who makes survival look routine not through grand victories, but through steady reliability, sound judgment, and foresight. You've achieved the dream. Live long enough to help others do the same. One morning, you catch yourself making disapproving noises at juveniles. It hits you. Age isn't just time, it's irritation earned through mistakes, stress, and near-death experiences. Watching young adults attempt advanced foraging techniques, you see only inventive ways to fail. That's not how you assess soil composition, you mutter as Dash digs in hopeless ground. Steady, supervising nearby, offers different learning styles, which you translate as, yes, they're wrong, but complaining won't help. You reply, when I was their age, you learned fast or became someone else's learning experience. Gradually, you shift from active leadership to advisory roles. Your energy now favors conservation, and patience is reserved for genuine effort, not preventable mistakes. Officially, you handle strategic oversight in practice. The group keeps you busy with useful tasks, while limiting your opportunities to criticize. You assess territory, monitor the environment, and plan long-term strategy, drawing on decades of droughts, disputes, migrations, and recoveries. Your perspective is valuable, but it makes you impatient with plans that ignore hard-won lessons. You remind leaders that a promising water source once caused disastrous disputes. They thank you, but you see them noting your habit of emphasizing your greater experience. Your teaching now mixes history with blunt reality. Experience is what you get when you don't get what you wanted. You wanted beetles. You got an education in soil assessment. Students learn, but they also keep a respectful distance. You've become a living archive, predicting seasonal shifts, spotting threats early, and identifying opportunities others overlook. Your assessments carry weight because they span years, not just seasons, but this role is isolating. Younger meerkats respect your knowledge but rarely seek casual company. The desert remains constant while you change. What was once vast and intimidating now feels predictable. You've mastered it but also grown weary of seeing the same mistakes repeated. Your indispensability emerges quietly. Others seek information only you possess. Your lessons now blend technique with environmental literacy. Beetle hunting isn't just digging, it's reading soil moisture, predator pressures, and seasonal patterns. You teach strategic thinking, pattern recognition, and problem solving, turning survival from improvisation into competence. You've memorized every shift in the land where beetles rebound fastest, where water lingers, where predators wait. You provide nuanced risk-benefit analyses, rich beetle grounds that also attract hornbills, drought cycles requiring multi-season conservation, migration routes that balance food and safety. Your advice shapes decisions, making plans more successful and crises less severe. You've seen enough to tell temporary fluctuations from lasting ecological change. That insight prevents overreaction to short-term scarcity and keeps the group ready for real threats. The strategies you've shaped will benefit meerkats long after you're gone. Burrows, migration plans, resource policies, all rooted in your experience. Spring returns again, bringing a new crop of eager, hapless juveniles. Flutter digs holes without finding beetles. Pip's alarm calls are loud but useless, and Wobble's war with gravity continues. Watching them, you feel amused and nostalgic. Their mistakes are timeless. Every generation thinks enthusiasm will replace technique. Some things never change, you tell Steady. Your perspective now is philosophical. The young will learn or not, and the desert will carry on. You've moved from anxiety to acceptance, seeing successes and failures as small pieces of a larger cycle. The acacias still grow, termite mounds endure, beetles emerge and vanish, and the seasons turn. This continuity puts your life in context. You're part of something older and larger than yourself. The real achievement isn't dramatic victories, but the quiet persistence to witness these patterns repeat. You've succeeded not through heroics but through steady contribution and competence. You've lived long enough to understand your place in the ecosystem's ongoing story. The desert stays beautiful and indifferent, offering the same harsh opportunities to each generation. Your final seasons arrive without drama. Physical work fades. Observation and reflection take its place. Your old sentinel mound becomes a perch for contemplation. Younger meerkats still seek your counsel, adjusting expectations to match your slower pace. The desert feels less like a challenge and more like home. The burrow systems you helped design will shelter generations to come. Your survival strategies, refined over decades, now belong to the group. The cycle continues. Spring's abundance, summer's trials, autumn's preparations, winter's test. Through it all, you've proven that the most remarkable life can be the most boring, steady, reliable, and devoted to the survival of the community. Your legacy lives in safer burrows, smarter strategies, and generations better prepared because you lived long enough to teach them. The desert keeps turning, indifferent yet unchanged, and new meerkats begin the same journey, full of hope, determination, and the slow realization that unremarkable excellence is the highest form of success.